Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and strength coach, and I specialize in vestibular disorders. Welcome to my channel, The Steady Coach. Today we're going to be talking about visual vertigo, but before we start talking about visual vertigo, I wanted to make sure you knew about my free course, Healing Chronic Dizziness. There's no catch, it's actually completely free. I feel very strongly that this information should be freely available to anyone who needs it. There are many people who can't afford to work one-on-one with providers or don't have providers in their areas. So I will link below to the course so you can check it out. And if you'd like to support me and my work, please consider joining my membership community. I will link to that below as well. With my membership community, you'll have access to me through live Q&As and monthly seminars as well. So visual vertigo refers to dizziness symptoms that are triggered by visual triggers. And dizziness symptoms can range from your more classic dizziness or vertigo, to rocking, to spinning, to floatiness, wooziness, heaviness, brain fog, fatigue, wobbliness, a general sense of lack of coordination or lack of balance, and some other symptoms as well. So any of those symptoms that are brought on by visual triggers is often included under this umbrella of visual vertigo. And what are those visual triggers? Well, they also encompass quite a range of triggers as well. And these are all examples from clients that I've worked with. Some people find that just looking at busy patterns sets off their symptoms. Things like busy carpets, someone wearing a busy shirt, or looking at checkers or stripes. Other people find that being in wide open spaces like malls or baseball fields or large rooms or restaurants can be a trigger, whereas other people find that being in really small enclosed spaces where the visual stimuli, in other words, the things that you're looking at, are really close. Some people are bothered just by busy visual stuff altogether, and that can include things like looking in the fridge or walking down a grocery aisle. Other people specifically have difficulty with moving objects, or when they're moving and the things moving past them are flowing, kind of like they would if you were in a car and the trees were going by. That can bring on symptoms. So these are just some examples, and you may have other visual triggers that I didn't name here. But again, they all fall under this umbrella of visual vertigo. So today we're going to be talking a little bit more about why visual vertigo is even a thing, why vision tends to trigger symptoms for so many people with chronic dizziness. And we're going to review some exercises that you can do to help adapt your brain to those visual triggers. If you've seen other videos on my channel, you know that I very heavily talk about psychosocial components of chronic dizziness, namely stress and the contributions that stress make. So I will mention that in this video, but I'm sure many of you will be happy to hear I'm not going to belabor that point today. So visual vertigo, why does it happen? Well, to remind you, our balance system is comprised of 3 different senses. So unlike your sense of hearing or your sense of vision, the balance system relies on 3 different senses. So the first sense is your inner ears, or your vestibular system in your inner ears, which consists of organs that help translate how quickly your body is moving, what direction it's moving in, and it also helps give a sense of where your body is in space by giving information about gravity. The second sense that participates in this system is your sense of touch, or proprioception, and that doesn't just include the sense of your skin's touch, it also includes sensors that live in your joints that transmit information about where your joints are in space and how much load they're under, in other words, how heavy or how light something is when they're moving, as well as sensors in your fascia, which are connective tissues that connect between different parts of your body, specifically muscle systems. So all these come together and form the sense of proprioception, which helps your body know what your posture is, how the different parts of your body are related to each other, and your position relative to the floor, especially through sensors in your feet. And then the final sense that participates in this balance system, of course, is your sense of vision. And this is the dominant one. The human brain tends to prioritize vision over other senses on a regular basis. It's a very important sense. So in other words, it already has a disproportional amount of processing power allocated to it. You can think of these 3 senses like the ingredients that you need to bake a cake. Each of these senses has to be put in the bowl in its exact correct proportions in order for the cake to come out the way that it should. Vision is like the flour of the cake. It's the base of the cake. It's the most important part. And then you can think of the ears and that sense of touch as perhaps the fat and the sugar that are added to the cake. So when something goes wrong with one of the senses, and we're going to talk in a moment about when that happens, the cake is going to be off. But the brain is going to try to compensate by adding some of the ingredients that you already have. So for example, if you have a viral infection of your inner ear, during that time, the brain is going to try to adapt by relying more on information from your sense of touch and information from your sense of vision. If you tend to wear high-heeled shoes, or you have neuropathy in your feet, so you don't have a good sense of touch in your feet, your brain might naturally start to rely more on your vision and your ears. This is a completely normal brain adaptation that it is doing all the time to make sure that we're always functioning optimally and we're always getting the sensory information we need to make good predictions. And we've talked a little bit about that on this channel, but I want to expand and remind you that the brain doesn't just react to things. Although it looks that way to us, the brain does not just react. If the brain just reacted, then sometimes we would be too slow to react in order to survive. There's a reason that older drivers tend to get into fewer accidents up to a certain point when their senses start to fail them than younger drivers. Older drivers have more experience. Their brain is better at predicting the behavior of other drivers and their own behavior, or maybe the conditions on the road. If we were just reacting all the time, it would put a tremendous amount of processing power on our senses. Our brain would be relying heavily on all this information and processing all this information from our senses all the time. And we wouldn't be able to do things like post fun pictures on social media, read books, or study. So the brain being able to make predictions is both a safety feature and it's the feature that allows us some spare processing power to do creative things like language, reading, math, work. So how do predictions work? Well, the brain learns from experience, and you can think of it as having some templates that it stores inside. When it's encountering a situation that is familiar in some way, and some situations may be more familiar than others, it'll pull up a few different templates to compare to the current situation. It then compares sensory information, so information from your senses, to the templates that it already has. So to make this really simple, it's like your brain is using a bunch of stencil sets, and then it's trying to match the incoming shapes to the correct stencil. That takes a lot less processing power than trying to build the whole picture from the bottom up. So the brain is a prediction machine. But in the meantime, what's important to understand is because the brain is a prediction machine, it can make errors about your senses in two ways. One way is that it can overweight one sense that shouldn't be overweighted. In other words, if your brain thinks that one of the senses isn't working properly and it should disregard information from it, it might let in more information from another sense. That would be the equivalent of not having eggs for the cake, and so we put more flour in the cake. The brain is still trying to bake the cake, but it just doesn't have all the ingredients, so it's adding more of the ingredients that it does have. When this happens, and more sensory information is coming in from one sense than there should be, the brain's processing capabilities can be overpowered. And when that happens, this can cause stress in the brain, and that can activate dizziness. And this can happen in particular with vision, which is what we're talking about today. So imagine if the brain is overweighting vision. Let's say the brain is ignoring your ears and it says, we need more ingredients for our cake because we've got to get a big cake out of this. So let's just take the ingredients from the vision sense instead. When it does that, when nothing crazy is going on, you're not really going to notice the difference. But when there's a whole bunch of weird, conflicting visual information coming at you, like when you're in a big space, when things are moving, when there's a busy pattern around you, that can overwhelm the processing in the brain. And the brain normally would be comparing this information to information from the ears to make sense of it. But since it's not using information from the ears, all it knows is that there's all this conflicting information coming in that doesn't make sense. Boom, dizziness. The other way that this prediction machine can go wrong is when the final product, in other words, the stencils that it's using, are only stencils that heavily include the sense that it's overweighting. And by that, what I mean is, again, going back to our example where vision is being overweighted and the ears are being taken out of the equation, the brain could potentially only use stencils, only use templates that rely on vision. And in those cases, the predictions will just be wrong because they're disregarding information from an entire sense. And that's an important sense. It's not a sense that we think of very much, but it's a sense that gives us a really good idea of how we're moving and where we are in space. So I've been using the example of the ears a lot, but I want to emphasize that this can happen even if there is no injury to the ears. Even if the ears are functioning completely fine, the brain can still overweight vision. It can still over-rely on vision and disregard the ears and or the sense of touch. So the first thing you should do if you have visual vertigo is make sure those other senses are okay, because visual vertigo can be caused in some cases by issues with the eyes. Now, I do think that it tends to be overdiagnosed as an eye issue when it's actually a brain prediction issue. And that's my bias because I'm not an eye doctor, but I have seen many patients come to me who've seen optometrists who put special glasses on them and they're fixing the senses and it's doing nothing because the problem's not the sense, the problem is the brain. If the sense is sending in perfectly good information, but the brain has no idea what to do with that information, if it's overemphasizing one sense and not using another sense, people are still going to feel dizzy. So what do you do about visual vertigo? Well, again, can't not mention this in my videos. What drives brain prediction problems is often stress. So you should always, always, always be addressing stress when you're dealing with visual vertigo. I will link to some videos where I talk about the effects of stress and what neural circuit dizziness is, because visual vertigo usually is neural circuit dizziness. But I wanted to give you some practical ideas for how you can desensitize yourself or help adapt your brain to weighting these different senses more normally. In other words, how to teach your brain to stop over-relying on that vision and start using your ears and your sense of touch again. So the first type of exercise that you can do is general gaze exercises. But instead of just doing exercises involving head turns and shaking your head and moving around, which I'm sure you're already doing, and if not, I'll demonstrate them, you should also be thinking about the background in which you're doing them, because the real key that you're trying to emphasize here is teaching your brain how to suppress information that's not important. In other words, how to turn down the volume a little bit on the vision so that the ears and the sense of touch can help contribute to the information heading to the brain. Or in other words, help the brain make more accurate predictions based on all the senses, not just vision. So to do that, what you would do is take one of your gaze exercises, and one example of that might be something just like visual tracking, which we've talked about on other videos. So you'd hold your object in front of you and you'd let your eyes follow the object, keeping your head still. But you would progress this exercise through different visual backgrounds. So you might start this exercise in just a room or against a blank wall, but then you would progress it to in the background of checkers or stripes or some other still visual trigger for you. Maybe the fridge, if that's a still visual trigger for you. And then you'd increase it to a busy background, such as a supermarket shelf. And you can easily find videos on YouTube that show this. I'll link to some below. And then you'd progress to a moving background, say a crowd of people that are milling around or walking through the aisles of a supermarket where there's visual flow. In other words, the objects aren't just still because you're moving, so they're actually moving along your field of vision. And then finally, you'd progress to misleading visual information. So for example, this would conflict with the direction that you're moving. So maybe you'd be walking, instead of walking with a crowd, you'd be walking against a crowd. That would be misleading because the crowd's moving and you're moving in the opposite way. Once you've progressed those kinds of visual backgrounds, then you can progress the exercise and challenge your balance system as well. So I've shown some of these progressions before, but simply put, you would start in a very stable position like sitting, you'd progress to standing, and then you'd start challenging yourself by taking a staggered stance, toe to heel, or perhaps even in a single leg stance with one toe on the floor from your other foot to help balance you. And then finally, you could start marching or walking. The other type of exercise that you can do is something we call sensory switching. So this combines balance training with also teaching your brain to switch between emphasizing different senses. And I know I've promised you guys a video on balance exercises, and I'm working on it. But in the meantime, I'm going to give you just a few ideas of balance exercises you can do. And then I'm going to show you how to incorporate sensory switching into those exercises. So here are some examples of balance exercises that you can use with sensory switching. So with this first one, you can straddle a yoga block or another low object. And first you can practice raising one foot and tapping the top, and raising one foot and tapping the top, okay? Then you can do this with your eyes closed. So you'll do one set, say you'll do 15 to 20 repetitions of the tapping, and then you'll close your eyes, and you'll do the same thing, but with your eyes closed. This is very challenging. If I don't fall, it's a miracle, okay? So that's sensory switching with that balance tapping exercise. If you wanna make this more challenging, what you can do is put a few objects in front of you. So I've got my yoga block in front of me, and you could put 2 other objects on the floor, and you can practice tapping 1, 2, back, and back, kind of in this rainbow arc with 1 foot in front. And then you can practice that same thing with your eyes closed. And then to make it more challenging, you can add a reactive component by having someone call out which block you should touch or which object you should touch, like right, left, center, okay? So someone would call right, and you'd have to touch the right and then come back. Left, center, okay? So that reactive component makes this a lot more challenging, and it also, if you do that with your eyes closed, it will really challenge that sensory switching capability. You can also play around with the kinds of objects you use for this exercise. The lower they are and the wider they are, the easier this will be. So with my yoga block, if I have it on this wide, low setting, that's gonna make this easier. Whereas if I have it on this setting or on this setting with a very small base of support and it's very tall, that's going to make the exercise more challenging. So that's how you can progress this exercise. Pick low, wide objects to start, and then progress the exercise with taller and less stable objects. Once you can do all this with your eyes open and switch to your eyes closed, I think you're gonna see a pretty big difference in your brain's ability to filter out irrelevant visual information. I hope that video was helpful for you guys. This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of balance exercises, but these are great ones to start working on if you have visual vertigo symptoms. And VRT exercises or vestibular rehabilitation exercises are something that you want to do. As always, I can't resist reminding you that stress reduction and managing other sources of anxiety and fear in your life are absolutely essential to managing chronic dizziness. So make sure you don't neglect that part. If you enjoyed this video, you found it helpful, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.